Welcome again to another edition of the Osteopathic Lyceum podcast. I'm going to attempt to touch on topics I've touched on before in relation to something that I stumbled across with respect to education in osteopathy. Now, with respect to education in osteopathy, especially in Canada, it is definitely a widely varied environment. What I would say is that as far as the actual practitioners that are produced, pretty much all the schools that exist are producing people that are capable on the fundamental level of doing the work that they claim they would do. My consistent claim with respect to the profession of osteopathy is that many people can do the actual hands-on work at a good level. However, their claims, mechanistic claims especially, are kind of out to lunch. They're a little bit larger than they need to be, and as I've touched on many times, from the environment of observation that the practitioners would have, the claims, they would just never be able to know the things that they're saying. So if you're talking about what's happening to somebody's liver from palpation, you're just, if you're right, it's a miraculous accident. And now some people can say, well, based on experience and based on different pieces of information and induction and whatnot, or inductive reasoning, I understand the claim, but the environment of observation doesn't allow one to be as accurate as they would want to be to make those claims. Now, that then relates back to the educational environment, at least within the Canadian context. Again, it's quite varied. And there is obviously the development of schools over time and new schools and new ideas, which is all a very good thing. The thing that I've spoken about with respect to understanding the assumptions upon which anything is built has quite a bit of value. So if any of the assumptions that anybody is making in introducing a new idea happen to be less than ideal or less than accurate, then everything that they build on top of it is going to continue to contain that flaw. So this brings me to the concept of critical thinking again. So if you look at the Osteopathic Lyceum podcast, episode 8, I definitely talk about critical thinking, how it sort of showed up. Now, I didn't necessarily go back into Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and things of that nature. Socrates, there's an argument as to whether or not Socrates was a real person, as far as I understand, versus a tool that Plato was using to describe things or to as a method to introduce ideas and work through them by using a storied figure. Now, I do not know the accuracy of that argument. I just know that the argument at least exists. But Socrates is the person that people will point to with respect to the concept of critical thinking, as far as what we have in written record, as far as starting the arc that ends up where we are today. Now, as I noted in that episode, John Dewey is the person sort of most responsible most recently for the term. What I'm going to do for those who have video here, I am going to share my screen so you can see this. The first thing I want to do, actually here, if you go to the Wikipedia article on critical thinking, you'll see why I talk about, or at least why I bring up the concept of Socrates, right? So classical period, Plato indicated that the teachings of, and I'm reading here, so let me do this more accurately. Within the article on Wikipedia, which is, at least in this case, trustworthy enough, or it will point you in directions where you could find more information if you wanted it. If you look at the history section, in the classical period, 5th century to 4th century BC of ancient Greece, the philosopher Plato indicated the teachings of Socrates are the earliest records of critical thinking. In an early dialogue by Plato, the philosopher Socrates debates several speakers about the ethical matter of the rightness or wrongness of Socrates escaping from prison. Upon consideration, Plato concluded that to escape prison would violate everything he believes to be greater than himself, the laws of Athens, and the guiding voice that Socrates claims to hear. So again, you can see very, very superficially that Plato is where we get information about Socrates. We don't get information about Socrates from Socrates. We get it from Plato. So that's where at least some people might make the argument Socrates was a figure to convey ideas. So he may be more of a character than a real person, but whatever. In that little blurb, really what they're talking about, or if you were to boil things down and try to get to more of an appropriate ontological category that's probably more of an ethical argument than a critical thinking argument. So argumentation on any level could then, you could replace the concept of argument and debate with the term critical thinking, but argument and debate would maybe be their own ontological category or category that no longer divides into anything else, although it would show up in many other categories. So critical thinking ontologically or with respect to a category that can be observed that does not divide into anything else, superficially is likely not a thing. Now, if you go through this article, you'll get the etymology and origin of critical thinking, definitions. There's a variety of definitions. The variety of definitions makes it superficially easy to begin to try to consider, with the variety of definitions, whether or not it is a thing, or you could simply attach to the definition that you like the best. If you like one the best, then that's the definition. But if there's a variety of definition, you superficially see a general lack of agreement. You see, as far as an ontological category, that it does not coalesce into one thing. It breaks out into many things that don't have maybe stable features. Logic and rationality, blah, 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 deduction, abduction, and induction. These are actually formalized terms with respect to argumentative process or thinking process. So deduction is the conclusion drawn from the structure of an argument's premises by use of rules of inference, formerly those of propositional calculus. Right? Induction is drawing a conclusion from a pattern that is guaranteed by the strictness of the structure which it applies. Abduction is drawing a conclusion from using a heuristic that is likely but not inevitable given some foreknowledge. So deductive reasoning is what you see most in what you would call the scientific method. So the hypothetical deductive process, hypothesis, test hypothesis, deduce information from the testing of the hypothesis. Induction, drawing a conclusion from a pattern, right? So there's a better way to say this, so I'm not going to say this well. So I'm going to leave it alone for the reality that I'm not going to do inductive thinking its proper service, right? That's a funny way to say it. I'm not going to do a good job appropriately explaining inductive reasoning, but just to know that this is here. So you see there's some very formal definitions. There's some very formal definitions of the processes of thinking that don't necessarily require the term critical. They're just thinking terms. You go down habits of mind, research, and critical thinking, education. So you see, with respect to education, John Dewey is noted here. So to read from this, John Dewey is one of many educational leaders who recognize that curriculum aimed at building thinking skills would benefit the individual learner, the community, and the entire democracy. Critical thinking is significant in the learning process of internalization, and the construction of basic ideas, principles, and theories inherent in content. Critical thinking is significant in the learning processes of application, whereby those ideas, principles, and theories are implemented effectively as they become relevant in learners' lives. So there's no citation there. That's just somebody providing a thought. Okay, so what I'm going to do on purpose is I am going to sneak through here for a moment so I can get to another page if it lets me, and it's not letting me because there we go. That's what I wanted to do. Please excuse me for a moment. So if we go to what I cited before, one of the things that I cited before with respect to critical thinking, you go to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Let me try to briefly run through this. No, I'm not going to do that. The history, so Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, right? To read from this, with respect to history, use of the term critical thinking to describe an educational goal goes back to the American philosopher John Dewey in 1910, who more commonly called it reflective thinking. He defined it as active, persistent, and careful consideration of any belief or supposed form of knowledge in the light of the grounds that support it and further conclusions to which it tends. and identified a habit of such consideration with a scientific attitude of mind. His lengthy quotations of Francis Bacon, John Locke, and John Stuart Mill indicate that he was not the first person to propose development of a scientific attitude of mind as an educational goal. So again, as I noted here, in a better way than I did in episode 8, it didn't start with Dewey, but Dewey's the person who used the term critical thinking, but he changed the term quite quickly. He didn't continue to use the term. He used critical thinking initially, and then he turned it into reflective thinking, and there's other terms, but he's definitely noting that he identified through quotation the behavior that he believed lined up with what he was calling critical thinking or a scientific frame of mind superficially. Now, if you look into current psychological literature, which would primarily be cognitive psychological literature, because cognitive psychology is attempting to use experimentation to identify thinking. Critical thinking, in any of its definitions, is not really identifiable in cognitive psychology. So it is a description of a set of ideas and behaviors that some people appreciate. So they're trying to use it to communicate something. But if you actually attempt to examine it and isolate it, which is difficult because you can't actually observe a thought, you can observe the output of the thought, which is really what anybody who's talking about critical thinking is going to do. You observe the outcome of the thought in either action or behavior or word. So word can be an action and a behavior, whether it's spoken, written, or typed. But what you're seeing is the outcome of the process. Critical thinking, or rather cognitive psychology, is not able to identify critical thinking. It's just not an ontological category that presents itself with any consistency. However, thinking processes, detail-oriented thinking processes, show themselves quite consistently. This is best represented, as far as I am aware, in transfer literature. Transfer literature, you're going to see near transfer and far transfer. Far transfer is really probably the thing that best would associate with the concept of critical thinking, the ability to take a non-tangible thing and apply that non-tangible thing in highly varied circumstances or highly varied environments or highly varied uh, situations, whatever word you seem to prefer, whatever word helps that stick. Far transfer is probably a better category to identify the thinking processes with respect to abstract things, non-tangible things, whether it's say a problem-solving framework or a causal plot in a story, whatever it happens to be. Far transfer is probably the more appropriate place to look for that with respect to best evidence, with respect to education, and with respect to the ability to observe thinking processes. So again, I've gone over that critical thinking with respect to cognitive psychology is not necessarily an identifiable thing, but far transfer is. Far transfer likely overlaps well with many of the definitions that you will stumble across with respect to critical thinking. Critical thinking is really more so an accepted thing in philosophy, not necessarily in experimental psychological examination of humans and their behaviors, especially in the frame of cognitive psych. Anyways, lots of rambling to try to get to a place where maybe we can connect this to osteopathy appropriately. Again, if you like the term critical thinking and you do not necessarily make yourself aware that it is not necessarily a thing with actual observable thinking, as is highlighted through the frame of cognitive psychology, then whatever definition or definitions of critical thinking that you like are probably philosophical in their nature and not necessarily observable. They probably overlap much better with far transfer, an abstract, non-tangible thing that is consistent and stable across varied circumstances or varied situations. So if you look at the WHO benchmarks for training in osteopathy, and you look up research methodology, this is where you'll usually see the term critical analysis. So I think that's the first year. So if you can actually see this screen, I've got the curriculum outlay with hours, which I have talked about before. Curriculum setup with respect to hours only indicates hours. It does not indicate competency. And the WHO document does not necessarily set forth any assessment standards. It just sets forth idealized hour counts. The updated CSA document, so there's the European CSA and the Canadian CSA, they do talk a little bit more about assessment approaches, and they do at least superficially talk about competency-based assessment approaches, but they don't necessarily make them as clear as maybe they could. But anyways, you see here research methodology, quantitative and qualitative, including critical analysis, right? The term critical shows up, research methodology, critical analysis, right? Research methodology again, quantitative and qualitative, critical analysis, research ethics. So within the research studies again, so you see this in the next block. Research methodology, quantitative and qualitative, including critical statistics, critical analysis, right? Research methodology, quantitative and qualitative, critical analysis, dissertation research paper. Critical analysis is not necessarily critical thinking. Critical analysis, you could probably do a much better job appropriately defining and saying that and providing measurable behavior cues or measurable knowledge production cues, whatever it is. Critical analysis is can they identify these things within a research paper? Can they identify where the hypothesis is? Can they identify whether it's inductive, whether it's deductive, whether it's qualitative, whether it's quantitative? You can then put that forward into an assessment approach that would be able to be built into something that is reliable and valid. You could do that, but the term critical pops up a lot and it invokes other ideas. So critical analysis is probably an identifiable ontological category, right? Or a construct. Construct is the better term because it won't divide further into something else, especially if you attempt to measure it appropriately. And the way to figure that out is you would attempt to use those measurements for critical analysis and then do something that's somewhat similar and see if there's overlap. If there's overlap, then one of those things isn't its own thing. It's really more the other thing. And I'm doing what I think may not be the best job of describing that. But basically, you break things down into their constituent parts. When they break down no further, you probably have a concrete construct. And then you'll find that concrete construct in other things that really aren't the thing they say they are. They're the concrete construct that lives underneath, which is why I would say that far transfer is probably a better construct for what people claim as critical thinking. Now, with respect to attempting to teach people to think critically, if that is the term that you're using and you're not acknowledging that it is not an observable construct, then everything you build on top of that, at least with respect to your ability to claim what it is flawed. It doesn't mean you're not teaching people strong, detail-oriented behaviors with respect to how they would think through the information that they find within osteopathic practice as with respect to diagnostic information and identifying red flags and identifying contraindications and things of that nature. But those are really much more detail-oriented processes. They require details to be involved. Otherwise, you will miss things and come to inappropriate conclusions. So the framework for identifying red flags, the framework for identifying contraindications, the framework for making meaningful clinical choices with respect to diagnostic findings, that is not critical thinking. That is a detail-oriented framework that is heavily, heavily constrained by the practice environment. So you are external to the patient, you are identifying movement-based information, and you are working within altering that movement-based information. You are not meaningfully or in a valid way assessing any internal processes. You are getting information that is a proxy for internal processes, but you can't be sure that that's what's going on internally. With respect to red flags, anything that even looks like a dangerous internal process, you refer out because you're not going to find any more information in that external environment. You're not going to accurately identify the internal pathology. You're just going to identify that there is a sudden change in cognition through things like memory. There's a sudden change in speech patterns. There is slurring of speech. These are all things you don't need to know what it is, and you're not going to know that it is or is not a stroke, that it is or is not dementia. You're not going to know these things. You're just going to know that they're dangerous, right? So that's not a critical thinking thing. That is, I see this sign. The answer is an immediate referral to emergency services. Somebody shows up with recent trauma and very, very, very restricted movement, and I ask them actively to move the area that they're saying the trauma existed in, and there is no level of the requested movement. I do not know if it's a break. I do not know if it's a tear, but I know that I should not treat that area and that I should refer out. If I refer out and they come back and there is no known tear, there is no identified tear, there is no identified break, then I know that I have some reason to believe that it could be safe to work in that area, but I need to be exceptionally cautious. That is not critical thinking. That is detail-oriented thinking within a heavily constrained framework, which includes ethics and the law, right? The ethics is non-maleficence and beneficence and things of that nature. That's not critical thinking. With respect to taking motion testing, right, whether it is yield to pressure of soft tissues, or it is taking a large general motion and identifying where the restriction within that motion is and working on that in a constraint-based process. That constraint-based process is guided by the barrier concept. Don't make the patient say, ouch. And essentially, if you want to go direct and they make sure they don't say, ouch, you're looking to go in the direction of restricted motion without the tissue jumping or the tissue getting too tight or the tissue fighting or getting active. Or if you want to go indirect, you just want all that tissue to get soft. That is a highly constraint-based process. That is not critical thinking. It's actually experimental because if you have reason to believe based on previous experience that going direct is most appropriate, then you'll go direct. If that tissue fires up, you have to change how you're doing it. That is a constraint-based process that is not critical thinking. Even in the definitions that I don't necessarily agree with, that's not critical thinking. It maybe more accurately represents either near transfer or far transfer, depending on exactly the set of circumstances that you're talking about. It is a constraint-based process. It is not critical thinking. This is a clinical profession that is highly limited in the information that it can truly gather. If you teach people how to identify red flags and how to identify contraindications, you are increasing your confidence that that practitioner is going to be safe and not harm the patient. If you focus your teaching on how to identify when using the direct barrier is most appropriate, when using the indirect barrier is most appropriate, that's just a simple constraint-based process. That is not critical thinking. So the need for the concept of critical thinking in osteopathy is probably not there the way that one would hope it was there. But if you are looking to inculcate the scientific frame of mind or that scientific frame of thinking, then you can probably do it if you pay attention very well to the details of hypothetical deductive reasoning, to the details of inductive reasoning, to the details of abductive reasoning, to the details of identifying where a hypothesis is in a research paper, to identify or to pay attention to the details to identify whether it's quantitative or qualitative, to then teach statistics and whether or not the analysis done of the data collected was appropriate for the claim made or for the hypothesis that was generated. Those are detail-oriented processes. Those are not critical thinking processes, right? Those are very detail-oriented. So my general argument is that teaching the required details to function professionally are the things that matter. I will note very superficially that research appraisal is very valuable. I value it highly, but I don't know that you can meaningfully and clearly make the argument that large amounts of time spent appraising research will improve the identification of motion restriction, will improve the identification of how the patient is responding to whatever treatment method is chosen, or improve the outcomes for the patient. The research the critical appraisal of research would likely help somebody understand a little bit more of what might be going on in certain circumstances in an ad hoc manner, or rather a post hoc manner after the fact. So they've collected information, they've gotten information about what physicians have said, they put that together and they sort of build a picture, but that picture is still based on a lot of assumptions. It's not based on necessarily appropriate diagnostic information. Research appraisal is a detail-oriented, constraint-driven process. It is not critical thinking. It is not necessarily a scientific frame of mind. The scientific frame of mind is based on detail-oriented, constraint-driven skills. Teach the detail-oriented, constraint-driven skills, you're more likely to see an expert on the other end in those detail-oriented, constraint-driven skills. The same thing would then apply to osteopathic practice. Osteopathic practice is a physical skill. It does require thinking. The primary thinking that it really requires for safety is this safe or is it not? Is there a red flag? Is there a contraindication? Teach how to identify red flags and contraindications. Detail-oriented, constraint-driven. The answer is always refer out. This is not a complicated thing. As far as how to actually treat, teach how to identify motion restrictions, where they are, how to do it safely and not harm the patient. Teach how to take the motion restriction information found, turn it into a treatment. Within osteopathy, this is driven by the constraint of the barrier concept. So either take it in the direction of restriction without that tissue really activating, that tissue shouldn't jump, or go indirect, make it all soft. Again, highly constraint driven. So while there is a laudable attempt or a laudable goal with teaching what would be termed critical thinking, it's probably not a concrete construct. It's probably not the thing that you would want it to be. So you're better off, I would argue, teaching the detail-oriented, constraint-based processes of research appraisal and of clinical practice. So again, touching on critical thinking and then suggesting that the more appropriate framework to teach the constraint-based, detail-oriented process of clinical practice, FAR transfer is probably a better concrete construct because it is pointing to how you actually inculcate an abstract concept across a variety of circumstances so that abstract non-tangible concept is ever present but never tangible. So then you can lay details on top of it. And this is generally done by explicitly identifying what that abstract concept is, or that abstract construct, whatever problem solving framework, whatever you want to talk about, and how and providing a minimum of 2 examples or as many examples as you can, because that's how you take it from the abstract concept to the thing that will allow details to be added to it and drive decision making in a constraint based way. So FAR transfer is probably more useful for educating osteopathic learners or any healthcare learner than critical thinking. Critical thinking is a goal, but it is not a construct, would be my fundamental argument. So if you stuck with me that long, thank you for listening, and hopefully that helped. If you're an osteopathic educator, learn about FAR transfer, worry less about critical thinking. FAR transfer is probably a concrete construct that will allow you to figure out how to actually deliver the details and the skills that you're claiming that you want to deliver. So FAR transfer instead of critical thinking would be my argument. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk again soon.